Happy to be here, especially talking to Professor Chomsky. I'm going to begin by telling a story.
Okay, yes, please, Professor. Yes, please. Just want to make sure with the audience before we start that everything goes well. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you. Okay, just because now we are live with Professor Noam Chomsky and Professor Stephen Krashen, I just want to make sure with the audience that everything goes well. So do you hear me and see us well? I need your feedback, please.
I am.
Yes, everyone is joining us, so thank you very much. I need your feedback that everything goes well. So do you hear me well?
Yes. Yes.
Interesting. Yes, this is also a question to the audience. Okay, I'm checking. I know that people are joining us from different parts of the world, not only from Morocco. Of course, this webinar will be translated into Arabic, of course, for those who don't speak English.
Great.
So thank you. We can hear you. Thank you very much for the feedback. Okay. So also to the audience who are following us, I would like to remind you that the certificates of attendance will be issued to those who have attended this live webinar. That's why you are required to write your names in the comment section, and after the webinar we will share with you the registration form. Please fill it in with your information, including emails, names, and other information. Let's get started now. So good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, or good morning, or good evening, wherever you might be in this world. Thank you very much for joining us for today's webinar. It's my privilege now to extend to you a warm welcome on behalf of the Higher School of Technology, Moulay Ismail University in Meknes, Morocco. I'm very, very happy and honored to welcome our esteemed guests, Professor Noam Chomsky and Professor Stephen Krashen, who are going to talk about many topics pertaining to language acquisition, modern linguistics, grammar, and so much more. Actually, we've been looking forward to this historic day with you, professors, and we are extremely excited. So before this webinar starts or begins, allow me please to introduce our guests, heroes of many generations. Actually, they don't need any introduction, but for the sake of the new generation and maybe university students and researchers, I would give a brief introduction to them. So Professor Noam Chomsky is a linguist, philosopher, cognitive scientist, historian, and social critic. He is considered the father of modern linguistics. He is also a major figure in analytic philosophy and one of the founders of the field cognitive science. He holds a joint appointment as Institute Professor Emeritus at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, where he taught more than 50 years, and now Laureate Professor at the University of Arizona. And he is the author of more than 100 books on topics such as linguistics, war, politics, and mass media. He is one of the most cited scholars alive. Chomsky has influenced a broad array of academic fields. He is widely recognized as having helped to spark the cognitive revolution in the human sciences, contributing to the development of a new cognitivistic framework for the study of language and the mind. I'm also delighted to introduce Professor Stephen Krashen. Professor Stephen Krashen is a linguist and Professor Emeritus at the University of Southern California. He received a PhD in linguistics from the University of California, Los Angeles in 1972. Krashen's numerous papers and books have greatly contributed to the fields of second language acquisition, bilingual education, and reading. He is known for introducing various hypotheses related to second language acquisition, including the acquisition learning hypothesis, the input hypothesis, the monitor hypothesis, the affective filter, and the natural order hypothesis. Most recently, Krashen promotes the use of free voluntary reading during second language acquisition, which he says is the most powerful tool we have in language education. It's therefore one of the truly greatest honors of my life to welcome Professor Chomsky and Krashen. Please give a warm welcome to our esteemed guests. Thank you very much for having taken the time to be here with us for this enlightening webinar. Thank you, professors.
Thank you. Okay. I will.
So,
okay.
Yes, I think Professor Stephen Krashen is going to start first, and he's going to talk about language teaching and maybe his adventure, let's say, in speaking Spanish. So, of course, if you have any questions, we will have time after at the end of this webinar, and we'll be posing them to our guests. I'm sure they will be pleased to answer all of your questions. Thank you very much. So the floor is your, Professor.
Okay, thank you. My agenda the last few years has to been bring together knowledge from different fields that have unfortunately been independent, that have not helped each other, and I think we can help each other a lot more. Part of this is to look at our own experiences in language acquisition, and I'll tell you about my recent experience. During the pandemic, I love quarantine, staying home. It's been absolutely wonderful. I feel like Isaac Newton inventing physics or calculus and optics during the Black Plague, and he had so much more time to read. Anyway, Friday mornings, I've been going out and shopping at a local supermarket, and Friday mornings is a good time to shop because it's for old people only, which is very nice. And the first time I went there, the man who was in charge of ringing up my groceries and seeing what I had and paying my bill, I noticed that his name was Hispanic. So, of course, I can't help it. I spoke Spanish to him, and of course, he answered in English. I then was ready for it. Here's what I said. I'll do it in English, and then I'll show off and do it in Spanish. I said, I'll do it in Spanish first, just to show you how wonderful my Spanish is. I said, mi meta es hablar español como ustedes, y tú puedes ayudarme. Por favor, hablamos español. I said, my goal is to speak Spanish the way you do, in the plural form in you. Please help me, let's speak Spanish. He really liked the idea, very friendly guy. We spoke Spanish, and every time I've come back there for nearly a year, I make sure I get him in the checkout line, and we speak Spanish. Now, I have to tell you, all this is maybe a minute of Spanish practice every week in speaking and conversation. But I've gotten better. Here's how I know. Fidel, that's his name. We've become pretty good buddies. We chit-chat a little bit more, not much, but his Spanish is now more rapid. He's using more complicated words, more complicated grammar all the time. And my friends tell me, I've one friend, Viviana, I talked to her on the phone, Viviana Hall, and I spoke to her in Spanish, which I never did before. And Stephen, your Spanish is so good. How did you get so? It's getting better. Here's what's going on. It's not from talking to Fidel. It's from what I do at home. At home, I've been following the advice of my colleague, Benico Mason, who has developed a method of helping people get into reading called guided self-selected reading. What you do is you read lots and lots of extremely interesting but easy reading. They're called graded readers, made for students who want to get better. And I've got a pretty nice collection, and I've been reading graded readers in Spanish every day. Now, I can read authentic Spanish. I've read Isabella Allende and all that, and I can speak okay, but my Spanish is kind of in the middle. I'm not that good. It's like language number 4 or 5. It varies, but I'm getting better, not from the talking, not from the conversational practice, not from the output, but from going home and doing the reading. That's where it's coming from. And that is my point. That's what we've discovered in language acquisition. I'll come back to that in a moment. A couple of remarks on philosophy of science. The way we do science, I'll talk about 2 ways of doing it. Both I think are correct. One we have gotten from Karl Popper, who has said you can never prove a hypothesis, you can only disprove a hypothesis. And one counterexample is enough. A good one can destroy a hypothesis and render it invalid. Einstein talked about this. I could have 1,000 experiments, he said, showing that relativity is correct, but one real counterexample, it's all over. Now, when that happens, the thing to do, obviously, sometimes it's a real dead end and it's really over, but sometimes it's an invitation to look deeper and find a better hypothesis. So it has really been very productive. So this has been a good way of working. There's another approach, though, that is complementary, and this comes from Ralph Waldo Emerson, who has said, the value of a principle is the number of things it can explain. And my addition to that, especially when it works for fairly different situations, and this is what has happened here. This is what has happened to me. The principles of language acquisition are consistent with what we know from first language acquisition, second language and foreign language, bilingual education, heritage language, and of course, linguistic theory. I've been preparing for this. I've been doing my homework. I've been reading a lot of Chomsky, things I read in the past and things I hadn't read before. And oh my, the similar conclusions again and again. So in these fields, I have to tell you, have nearly unknown to each other, which is really kind of sad. Let me talk to you summarize what has happened in the last 45 years, and it won't take that long for sure. The first big hypothesis, we think we have two different ways of getting better in languages. You can acquire language, you can learn languages. Acquisition, we sometimes call the natural way, and a synonym is picking up a language. I was in Mexico for a few weeks and I picked up some Spanish that generally means you acquired it. It is a subconscious process. While it's happening, you don't know it's happening. Once you've done it, you're not always aware that it's there. The other process is language learning, which is conscious. We call this knowing about language. And the language teaching profession is nearly entirely based on conscious language learning. Those of you who've read the works of Noam Chomsky, you know that he actually talked about this before I talked about it. It's in several of his books, and he calls it cognizing as opposed to learning a language. So this is a common idea, which is why I think it's very helpful to read in areas outside your own. We are very good at language acquisition, first language and second language. We're not very good at language learning. Noam Chomsky talked about it in Reflections on Language, 1975, written in submitted in 74, which is before I got into it. Second hypothesis, the natural order hypothesis, which kept us very, very busy in the late 70s, early 80s. It says we acquire the rules of language in a predictable order. English has been very well studied for this. Some things in English as a first language obey this. Similar to what we see in English as a second language, the orders aren't exactly identical, but fairly similar. We know, for example, that the progressive tense, John is playing the violin, that one is early. The third person singular, which you'd think would be easy because it seems simple to us, that's very late acquired. In first language, there might be 6 months to a year between the two. We all know people who speak English as a second language very well, but miss the third person singular, don't always get it right, even though they get it right when they write. Well, this is, I think, that's number one. There is a natural order. 3 amazing hypotheses. You can't change it. You can drill the third person singular all day long, but just like good wine, it won't be acquired till its time has come. It's not simple to complex, as I've mentioned. A lot of things seem simple to us, but are acquired late. And it's not the language teaching syllabus. I made this mistake in 1981, where I boldly gave a speech at the TESOL conference to a standing room crowd only of 10 people. There were not enough chairs in the room, which I said, we now have the syllabus. Just tell us the natural order. We'll teach along the natural order. I now think that's completely incorrect. And I think this is quite consistent with the idea, again, from Noam Chomsky, that the language acquisition device is a mental organ, kind of like the kidneys or the visual system. You can't change the order of development. It's there, and it's what we're born to follow. It doesn't obey the biologist's view of what is simple to what is complex, okay? And if we impose an order on the development of the visual system, it's not going to help. You can't teach it. So that's another fascinating idea. Well, what about grammar? What is the role of grammar in language teaching? I've been misquoted as saying, don't ever teach grammar in a language class. Teach grammar, go to jail. It's a sin. Don't ever use it. Not quite my position. My position is it's really hard to do. You're not going to make much progress with it. What we have discovered is that teaching grammar, if you want to use grammar, there are daunting conditions that have to be met that make it very tough. We think consciously learn grammar is only available as an editor or a monitor. If you're speaking a language and you think you made a mistake, you can think of the rule, intervene, and correct what you've done if the rule is correct. But the conditions are tough. Number one, you have to know the rule consciously. And as we have learned from modern linguistics, as Professor Chomsky has said so many times, we have described only fragments of the language. Linguists always point out they don't know all the rules. The most grammar dedicated language teachers don't know all the rules. Our best students don't learn all the rules, and what they've learned, they don't always remember. So condition one, you've got to know the rule, and that is really impossible to do. Number two, you've got to be thinking about correctness if you want to impose this conscious knowledge. It's hard to think about correctness and understand and speak language at the same time. It's kind of like patting your head and rubbing your tummy at the same time. They're basically incompatible. Number three, you have to have time. Normal conversation does not give us enough time. Take a look at Reflections on Language. I have it right here, footnote 24, page 249, where Professor Chomsky points out, even if you could master the rules, we can't apply them in real time. And our studies have confirmed this again and again. There is one condition in which all these requirements are met. Comes pretty close. When you take a grammar test. When you take a grammar test, you study the rules, you're thinking about form, and you have time, because it's usually a written grammar test. And even then, what our studies have found is you don't do that well in applying the rules. It doesn't happen as easily as you think it should, and we always feel bad because we can't do it. Well, let me tell you what the research says about this. In the real world, we have found that the common view of language teaching will not work. The common view of language teaching, you teach people a rule consciously so they can master it consciously, and you expect them to master it right away, and then you practice with output, similar to the pattern practice that we've seen in so many audiolingual classes. Like you learn the third person singular, and then they give you sentences where you have to say it again and again and again until you, as they say, automatize it, and then you'll be able to use it. There has been a real mistake, a real confusion of cause and effect. What we think now is going on is if you acquire the language, if the conditions are right for language acquisition, the effect will be acquisition of language. The cause is language acquisition. The effect is knowing the rules of grammar and knowing the rules of vocabulary. And this happens only in one way, and here is the major hypothesis. We acquire language in only one way, and that's when we understand it. There is no other way it can happen. So if I give you a language lesson and I make it comprehensible, if I make it a German lesson and I say, das ist mein Kopf, hier sind meine Augen, ich habe zwei Augen, eins, zwei, ja, Und hier sind meine Ohren, eins, zwei. And you can more or less understand that you are acquiring a little German. The amazing thing, whether you want to or not, it happens without effort, and it happens without worrying about it, and you can't stop it. The only thing the conditions for language acquisition, it needs to be comprehensible. You need to pay attention to the input. You need to pay attention to the message. So it has to be interesting. The word I like is compelling. Very interesting. So interesting that you forget that you're listening to another language. We have amazing amount of evidence this is true. We have found it in many ways. In our work, the work I've done with Professor Benico Mason, who I just mentioned, we have found the best way to make sure the input is just right, optimal, is to rely on stories. Fill language classes with stories. I got interested in this driving on Pacific Coast Highway. I live about, 30 miles, 50 kilometers from the city, from Santa Monica. And before the pandemic, I drove to Santa Monica at least 2-3 times a week. And I drove Pacific Coast Highway. I had to go for 2 reasons. That's where Gold's Gym is. And as you can tell, I'm a bodybuilder. And also, I'm addicted to my grandchildren, and I love to go and visit them. So what do you do when you're driving? Oh my, it gets so boring. I don't listen to music anymore, because if you want good music, you got to subscribe to certain stations, and I don't want to do that. It's talk radio, and oh my, it's still all about Donald Trump. So what do you do? I went to the library and took out stories on discs and other means of hearing stories. The stories they had, all in English, were not classics. I'm, college professor. I should be listening to great literature, but I was listening to bestsellers, ordinary, everyday novels, detective stories, historical and romances, all these things. Guess what? They're good. They're really good. The first one, Harry Potter, of course, which is really an essay on education. J.K. Rowling really understands what goes on in schools. It's marvelous. And what's happened to me is what happens to some of you. You pull up the driveway at home, you don't get out of the car until you finish the chapter, because it's so interesting. These so-called everyday best-selling novelists are very, very talented. I'll get back to that. So stories are really interesting, really good. And I also have a way of helping you with your social life. Not only want to help you with your job in teaching and language acquisition. What do you do when you're invited to a party and you know you're not going to know anybody? Well, here's what you do. You go watch the latest 3 movies. You can go up to any group of people and you can go up to them and you can say, have you seen Terminator 29? And you will have a conversation. And the conversation is very often worthy of any literature class. They will talk about the characters, the plot, whether it was well done, whether the casting was right, and whether the story was meaningful and interesting. So-called ordinary people do this very, very well. Beginning language teaching is stories. A method developed by Dr. Benico Mason called story listening. Here's what she does. She takes a story, usually a story that has stood the test of time, like Grimm's fairy tales, and she uses it in her advanced beginners class at the university in Japan. She tells the story, but she prepares it. She finds the words she thinks are going to be difficult. Teachers know this. And she has a way of making them comprehensible. She might do a translation, draw a picture. Drawing a picture is the favorite method, supplying context, etc. It's designed to make the story more comprehensible. You are not encouraged or told to learn these words for next time. What we have found in study after study, that's the best way to acquire the vocabulary. We've compared that to what happens if you have vocabulary teaching activities. Write 3 sentences with every word, et cetera, et cetera. Just telling a story is much more efficient. Gradually, over time, vocabulary grows. And this is on delayed tests, etc. Now, the goal of all this is to develop what we think is the most powerful means of language development, and that's reading. Reading fiction, reading interesting fiction. As Professor Chomsky has pointed out, we will find that we will learn more about human beings from reading novels than from studying, psychology, etc. I've come to absolutely the same conclusion. I am amazed at how good this is. We've done studies on this. I'll talk about how Dr. Mason does it. She introduces people to fiction by using a method called guided self-selected reading. Her students had access to lots of easy books, a library of 1,000 easy books in English. They were helped by the teacher to find books right for them, but they made the final selection. They read the books for pleasure, no questions at the end of the chapter. You don't like the book, you put it down. They do this for 2-3 semesters. The goal is to move on to authentic reading eventually, but that takes time. It takes 2-3 semesters of reading lots of easy books. That's what I've been doing at home in between going to the supermarket. It really does work. One study we did this with subjects ranging in age from 21 to 78, ranging in duration from 4 months to 3 years. They read lots and lots of easy books. We gave them a standardized test. Here's our conclusion. We found that for each hour they read, they gained a small but respectable amount on a major standardized test. They all gained pretty much around the same amount, even though they read different things, mostly fiction. And we calculated if they read an hour a day for 3 years, what they like, they go from fairly low levels all the way to what you call academic competence in the language. So this is a major breakthrough, and this is not the only study. There are lots of studies in my best-selling book, soon to be major motion picture, right? The Power of Reading. I've gathered all these studies together, and they all come to very similar ideas. I'll mention one more done by Jeff McQuillan. Jeff McQuillan looked at the 7 Harry Potter novels and analyzed the vocabulary. And his conclusion was, if you read all 7 of these, you're way ahead. You have acquired nearly all the academic vocabulary you need for success in school. These words come back again and again with enough times to help you acquire them. So reading itself gives you vocabulary, gives you spelling. Are you listening, Donald Trump? It gives you writing style. It gives you the basics of written literacy, including academic literacy, if you read enough in any area. Again, most of this comes from fiction, from bestsellers, etc. Other things, research from the University of Michigan, Keith Stanovich and his colleagues. People who read more know more. And this is based on people reading light fiction that they get out from the library, from the bookstores. They know more about a lot of school subjects. They know more about science. They know more about history. They also know more about practical matters. It gets better. People who read a lot have more empathy. They have more empathy for others. Barack Obama has talked about that. I can get along with people who seem very different from me because of the novels I've read. Excuse me, you meet more people in novels than you do in everyday life. You are there with the author, the person telling you the story, and you meet all kinds of interesting people. Also, if you read a lot, another thing the research shows, you avoid simple solutions. You know the world is complicated. Obama was interviewed on this. It was as if he had read all the research. It came to very similar conclusions. Now, we have found this in second language. We have found this in first language. We have found this everywhere we have looked. We have also found this in bilingual education, especially in the more you read in your own language, the more you know about the world. The more you're going to understand when you read in English. It helps directly, in fact. We have been working on what's called heritage language. I'll tell you just a bit about this, and then I'll finally shut up. Heritage language is the language children pick up at home from their parents, not the language of the country. Typically, when they go to school, when they're in kindergarten, first grade, are pretty good in their heritage language, but by the time they get to secondary school, they can hardly talk to their grandparents. English takes over in the United States. The heritage language is gone. We do have a couple of interesting cases that have pushed us, I think, in a very exciting direction. My colleagues, Grace Cho, Lucy Say, have looked at cases. Well, I'll tell you what Grace did. It's a great way of doing research. She went to a party in the Korean neighborhood, which is her background. And she met a lot of Korean Americans who were, some of them were born in the United States and the rest came quite young. And she found they all spoke Korean pretty well. Amazing. And she asked them, she said, can I interview you? She did interviews. The common denominator, they were readers in Korean. They read comic books, they read magazines, they read novels. And they gave reading the credit for their competence in Korean. Again, they did not go to Korea, have education there. They didn't, take extra, the classes they took weren't very good, heritage language classes. Generally, they avoid them. Lucy Say has found very similar solutions from very similar experiences from a variety of languages. Now, why can't we just try this out? Why don't we just tell people, start reading books in your own language? Access. The books aren't there. It's very easy to go to a library or bookstore, find books in English. Not so easy. Even in Spanish. Sandra Pucci, University of Wisconsin, looked at bilingual kids and growing up in Los Angeles. Very few books in Spanish in the school library. If you think Spanish is tough, try the other languages. Try Farsi, Persian. Nishan Ashtari has interviewed people who are from Iran and looked and seen what they read, etc. Same kind of thing. They found that elementary classes were terrible because they were done with traditional techniques. They basically, people told her, pushed her away from Farsi. She, in the area where we are, in the Los Angeles area, in Westwood and Beverly Hills, there are lots of Farsi speakers, people from Iran. There used to be bookstores where you could go get a lot of Farsi books. Dr. Ashtari visited several of these bookstores, talked to the owners. They said, well, the kids come in, they don't speak Farsi anymore, and we don't have books for them. They have the classics, books that educated native speakers would find difficult, and pedagogical grammars to improve your Farsi. She went to a local library in this area and used a technique, what we call an unobtrusive measure technique. She took books off the shelf that were Farsi books. Most of them were pedagogical grammars for people who wanted to get better in Farsi. The method she used, which Jeff McQuillan had used before, she looked at the smudge marks to see how far people had gotten in the books, fingerprints, etc., where the pages were turned. The average person who picked up one of these Farsi, teach yourself Farsi books, quit after 5 pages. Wow. She found in the Los Angeles Public Library, the libraries did not have a lot of Farsi books. The ones they had were not, only about 12 were taken out at that time. So this is the problem, and it's very easy to solve. The problem, let me talk about one other issue because it'll be short. What about literacy, teaching phonics? Oh my, you're, Dr. Chomsky, you're at a hotbed of anti-phonics research at Arizona, where Yetta Goodman still is, and they have been heroic in presenting the other side of the case, Kenneth Goodman, et cetera. The mood now, what you find in the media, is that phonics is the answer to everything. Phonics is consciously learning the sound spelling correspondences and doing exercises and drilling them. Here's what the research shows. This is called intensive systematic phonics. All you get when you do that, if that's all you do, children are better at reading words presented in a list and pronouncing them out loud. They do no better in reading comprehension. Not only that, there's very good evidence that people acquire the rules of phonics through reading. I have been experimenting with this. I've done this with audiences and on Twitter once. I've asked fluent readers in English, educated adults, I say, I'm going to give you a word. Tell me how the final letter is pronounced. And the word I give them is comb. They say, well, it's silent. Then I ask them, what's the rule? 5% have any idea what the rule is. Yeah, that B is silent after M, especially at the ends of words. So those people get at least that right. By the way, I didn't know this until I looked it up in Kenneth Goodman's books, okay? Then I said, well, what about when there's an affix? What about combing? Well, it's silent. How about combination? Well, then it's pronounced. What's the rule? Nobody knew, including me. Again, I relied on Professor Goodman. It turns out that if the affix is grammatical, as in combing, it's silent. If it's not grammatical, as in combination, it's pronounced. Nobody knows that rule. They all get it right. We acquire the rules of phonics through reading. We absorb them, etc. Now, let me talk about the future and what we can do about it. How can we haven't done too well about this. Most language teaching programs are based on behaviorism, are based on conscious learning of the rule, and then repetition. So I've even found catalogs where they claim they do natural approach, should be our methods, and it's all about redo the present tense, then we move to the past tense, etc., and we master them. Here's the problem. How are they going to find out? It's hard to find out. It's hard even for professionals to find out what's going on. 3 reasons. Most of the information is in books and journals. The books and journals are hard to read. There's one person is called torturous prose, okay? The articles are dense. The articles are very long. And the books are expensive. The journals are expensive. If you want to order one of Steve Krashen's papers from 1973, it costs you $40. The journal gets the money, not the person who wrote the article. Unless you work in a university that has a Class A library and you have borrowing privileges, you do not have access to the research. A brilliant case of this was pointed out by Jeff McQuillan and Lucy Say. They were dealing with bilingual education. They looked at the research on bilingual education over 10 years, and it was all very consistent. It works, it's good for English. Then he looked at what people talked about in the media and in the press, about half and half. Half of the press said, no, it doesn't, etc. It's not because they're arrogant and stupid, it's because they don't have access. It's very hard to find these things. I'm going to conclude with what I think is the solution. Part of the solution, colleagues, write short, clear papers so people can read them. Lichtenberg said in 1780 or so, if you ask someone the time, you don't want to know how wristwatches are constructed. Stay with the point. Your dissertations do not belong in journal papers. Write short, clear papers and publish at least some of your things open access. This is a movement started by Timothy Gowers, a mathematician, winner of the Fields Medal for Math, who has started an open access movement in Great Britain. Albert Pryor, one of my colleagues in India, has written editorials about this. This is what we want to do. Information can get around, at least to us, the academics, and we can introduce them to our students a lot faster. Okay, finally, there is an undertow. The old-fashioned way of doing it, I like to call it, I hope it's old-fashioned, of knowing rules and then doing pattern practice is so hard to get over. Alfie Kohn says there's an undertow. I find it hard to resist. When I see a new word and I don't know, I'm tempted to look it up, write it down, do a flashcard. So I sympathize with people who are addicted to this and find it hard to give up. But if you find something that's compelling and interesting, you will not be, the undertow will have far less effect. Okay, I've talked more than enough. Thank you. It's now time for the master to speak. Professor Chomsky, je vous donne la parole. I give you the speech.
Well, lots of fascinating points. Since there isn't a lot of time, I'll just mention a few that resonated with me very significantly. One is at one point you talked about change from language acquisition to language development. And I think that's a very significant idea. Language isn't really learned, it just grows in the mind. It's something that develops naturally, automatically, along a fixed program that's biologically determined. We have a great deal of evidence of this from first language learning. A young child, an infant, will just disregard corrections because it's not what fits with what's coming next in their language growth. It's almost like learning to walk. You don't learn to walk. It just comes automatically. At a certain point, child stands up, starts moving, figures it, gets to understand how you distribute your weight. Nobody's taught you this, but a lot of calculation and computation goes into simply walking down the street. You don't know the rules. You couldn't know the rules. Maybe some biologist could figure out what they are, but that's not the way you pick up walking. You do it because it's interesting, which is another crucial point that you made. It has to be interesting. And for a young infant, picking up the language is just an interesting, exciting thing. So it happens automatically. Children will pick up at the peak periods of language acquisition. Children, infants, actually 2 or 3 years old, will pick up a word every waking hour. They means basically one presentation. It's interesting to them. They want to understand what's going on. They have an internal rich structure of mind, which just goes into operation with very limited stimulus and leads to rich understanding. And that's true all the way through life. It's also true when you're studying in college, let's say. You could take what Professor Krashen has talked about and think of and adapt it to taking a course in college. There's several models of how to do it. One is the model that sometimes called pouring water into a vessel and then having it come out in a test. We've all had experiences like that where you took a course in college and you weren't interested in it and you studied for the exam and got an A, and 2 weeks later you forgot what the course was about. That's one way of so-called teaching to test, worst possible way. The other is to pursue something you're interested in, and then it'll just become part of you. You pursue it on your own initiative, on your own, with your own internal drive. Answer the questions that you yourself are raising just becomes part of you. And very much the same is true of language acquisition, and Professor Krashen's research has demonstrated it very effectively for second language acquisition, first language acquisition. The information that we have about it is pretty much the same, just grows in the mind at its own pace because of the interest of the child, the drive, internal drive of the child to try to understand the world around them. That's just like an infant constantly asking the question, why? Kids can drive you crazy by asking why. Every answer you give, they want to know the next answer. Why that, Well, it's pretty much the same with language acquisition and other forms of what Professor Krashen correctly called development. Things just develop in the mind in their own manner if you create an environment which is interesting and stimulating and that the person wants to explore on their own because it attracts them. The other point that stands out from Professor Krashen's remarks is kind of an unpleasant one. He pointed out that the way to gain rich understanding, not only of the language, but of the society around you, of other people, history, and so on, is by reading. Reading has very sharply declined. There are many measures of this. You go into it's gotten to the point where people my age, professors my age, want to give away a lot of books because we have way too many books and don't know what to do with them. Well, it used to be that you'd give them to the university library, or maybe you'd give them to the local libraries. Can't do it now. They don't want them. They don't know what to do with books. People don't come to look for books anymore. They're busy with this thing in their hands. The level of reading is very sharply declined. You see it in the school educational programs. Books that used to be at what was regarded as the 8th grade level are now being read in 12th grade. Because the students I teach right now at a state college, it's very different from elite university where I spent most of my life, and it's interesting. Students are very bright. They haven't read a book. They hardly know what it is to read a book unless it's assigned in class. On their own, they wouldn't know how to pick up a book. They don't know how to write an essay except in the form that was taught. All of this is gone, very sharply declining. And considering what Professor Krashen explained very eloquently about how reading enriches your life, your understanding, your outreach, your creativity, it's a pretty sad commentary on the way the world is developing. And I think serious steps have to be taken to try to reverse and overcome that. Not very clear how, in part because of the attraction of superficial stimulation of the kind that comes from the electronic devices that people are surrounded with. It's actually gotten to the point where the number of universities in the United States have redesigned the sidewalks that students walk on so that they can put in a plaque on the sidewalk that says, "Look up," meaning don't just look at what's in your hand. There's a world out there. There are other people you could talk to. Don't just be glued to your virtual experiences. This is a malady that has to be overcome. I think an important conclusion from Professor Krashen's remarks is to emphasize the significance of this.
Comment?
Yes.
If this is true, it's a recent phenomenon. I was very interested in research on how much people read, and my last paper was 10 years ago, okay? And the title of the paper was "Stop Scolding Teenagers." I looked at all the studies on how much people read 1940, 1950, 1960. Up till 2010, kids are reading, especially when Harry Potter came out. They were reading a lot. And the more easy, pleasant reading you have, the more reading you might have in general. That might be part of the solution. A wonderful paper was published in the School Library Journal, one of my favorites. They put comic books in the library, this is about 10 years ago, and graphic novels, but did not allow them to circulate. You had to go to the library to read the comic books. Library traffic nearly doubled. The amount of non-comic book material taken out went way up. So maybe this is a path to make it happen, more reading in general. I also have to point out that just to show you how important I am considered the #1 researcher in the world on comic book reading. The reason I'm #1 is that I'm the only one doing the research on it. But we found some very interesting stuff. Kids who read comic books read other things. In fact, lower socioeconomic children who read comics read more than middle-class kids who don't read comics. So if we play it right, we may be able to use this as a bridge to encourage reading in general. So I'm optimistic about our being able to solve the problem. Thanks for bringing this up.
Thank you very much, Professor, for the for giving such informative and interesting presentation. So I would like to, in the same vein, I would like to ask you a question related to critical period hypothesis. Professor Noam Chomsky, how have your ideas on critical period hypothesis changed over the years? Are you more or less convinced to the theory now than you were initially?
Well, my main interest is this process of virtually reflexive development of language as the flowering of internal competence and principles. And over the years, we have learned a lot about the nature of this internal system. It has, at the very beginning, say 60, 70 years ago, there was a conundrum which has guided research in many ways. There seems to be a serious contradiction in the enterprise of trying to determine what is the internal given basis for knowledge of language and development of language. On the one hand, it seems that it has to be quite complex. The reason is because of what's called poverty of stimulus. The data available to a child doesn't come anywhere close to the wealth of knowledge that a child actually has at every stage of development, from 1 year old on. It's easy to show that by experiment with children, that what they know and understand is way beyond any experience they've had. That suggests strongly that the internal system must be very rich in order to account for the gap between sparse data and rich knowledge. That's one prong of the dilemma. The other has to do with the evolution of language. That wasn't very well known 70 years ago. It's increasingly been learned that language emerged in the human species within a very narrow window of time.
Interesting.
We now have strong evidence, genomic evidence, that humans, Homo sapiens, began to separate almost very shortly after they'd emerged. Humans began to appear in the biological record about 200,000 or 300,000 years ago. That's a flick of an eye in evolutionary time. And very soon they began to separate. But all the separated groups have the same language faculty. So that means it was already in place before the separation. There is no evidence for any meaningful symbolic activity prior to the emergence of some Homo sapiens, which, put that together, gives you a strong evidence that the capacity for language, which is the basis for our thinking, our reflection, our imagining, planning, everything, our creativity, everything we do, all seems to have emerged along with Homo sapiens. That's a very brief window of time.
Yep.
That suggests that the internal system must be very simple because it emerged so quickly. Nature would have just picked the simplest solution when the problem arose of developing a system with an infinite range of possible expressive devices, which is unique to humans. So when that change took place in the genetic material, nature would have picked the simplest answer to it, which is apparently the one that stayed with no changes. So we have a contradiction. Learning or development of language seems to require a very rich system the evolution of language seems to require a very simple system. That's been a lot of research over the last 70 years has been an effort to resolve this problem. We're now about at a point where you can see an answer, where you can see how extremely simple mechanisms can give very rich consequences when you bring into account principles of computational efficiency, general principles of the structure of complex devices, and so on.
Interesting.
That's the major change that's taken place, I think. And I think we're probably now on the verge of a new and quite exciting phase in the study of language and thought. And I mentioned the two because they're about the same. We really have no concept of thinking outside of linguistically articulated thinking. The two capacities, language and thought, seem to be essentially the same. And there are both species properties of human beings, common to the species, everywhere, no difference is known, unique to the species, no trace of it in any other organism. And we're finally beginning to get a grasp on how that language thought system might have emerged suddenly and might have the capacity to overcome the extraordinary gap, huge gap between data presented and knowledge attained. That's, I think, the primary development in linguistic theory over the past 60, 70 years.
Yes, you want, Professor Krashen, you want to say something?
About critical periods. I have a hypothesis about what's going on. I like to believe, I would love to believe that the language acquisition device never shuts off, that it's always there. And I started thinking about this in the 1960s when I was teaching school in Ethiopia, and I met a guy there named Gerald Mosbach from UK, and we had an interesting conversation. He said that when he was in secondary school, they all did French, and he hated it. It was poor methodology, boring. He hated the teachers. He hated the French language. He hated the French culture. Now, to make things worse, you had to do an oral examination in front of all your teachers at the end, which is the worst torture you can do for an impressionable teenage guy speaking another language. So he decided he would show his disdain for the language, the culture, and the school. He came in by humiliating everybody. He came in with dressed French with a beret, with a glass of some liquid, pretending it was wine. And he did what he thought was foolishly exaggerate a French accent. He'd say, "Ah, bonjour, mesdames, messieurs, je suis très content d'être ici avec vous. Ah, comment ça va aujourd'hui, hein?" And his teachers said, "Wow, why weren't you doing that during the year? That was fantastic. Your accent is great." He could do that trying to make fun of his teachers, but he couldn't do that ordinarily. I found out later that Peter Ustinov, famous, wonderful actor, did movies in French where his French was totally convincing. He said, "I can't do that outside when I have a conversation." Conclusion, language signals what group you're a member of. That's its, accent is the one powerful way of doing that. And if you're not a member of the group that uses the language, you have a hard time using that accent. When I meet someone from the UK, I don't suddenly start speaking with a British accent. I find it extremely difficult to do. Versions I've heard all my life, I cannot imitate, or I'm very uncomfortable in doing so. It's club membership. Maybe accent does not obey the critical period. Maybe we have what we might call an output filter instead.
Interesting. Thank you very much. In the same vein, professors, so what's the relevance of the critical period for English speaking proficiency among immigrants? Don't you think the same way kids acquire?
Yeah, I think the implication is not to worry about it at all. They're going to get the accent of their friends, people they feel comfortable with. They're not going to get the accent of the teacher that's been shown over and over again. And there's not much we can or should do about it. This will make them comfortable when the need comes out or the feeling comes out that they should talk a slightly different way. Okay, my colleague Nushan Ashtari told me that when she was a young girl, she became a tomboy. She's not anymore, but that was the role. There was a special language they used, a special way of speaking that she wouldn't use now. I'm telling you this because you know all about it. It happens to all of us. Don't worry about it. Teaching it won't help. I've looked at the research on teaching accent. It's the same as teaching grammar. You've got to be focused on certain forms. It's limited to simple rules, etc. And when your mind is off it, you can't do it. So I would say, let's not worry about it.
Agree. And I'm afraid I'll have to leave. I have other commitments coming.
Oh, gosh. Okay. Sorry, it took too much time. Oh, my.
Yeah. Sorry for that. So, Professor, are you going to leave now?
I'm afraid I do, yeah. Sorry.
Yeah. So if you want to add something before you leave, that we can just the contribution of linguistics to language teaching and learning before you leave.
Well, it's a bit like asking, what's the contribution of biology to being a great athlete? That's for the coach to determine. The biologist can't determine it. If you can find, if people who are involved in particular developing, helping capacities to develop, if they can draw from the background science, great, but they're the ones who have to decide. Afraid I do have to go.
It's been an honor and a pleasure, Professor Chomsky, and thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you very much for that eloquent exposition. Learned a lot from it.
Thank you very much, Professor, for joining us. Thank you very much. I think, Professor has to leave now. That's why, because we are running more than 1 hour.
My fault.
Yeah, no, it's fine. It's fine. Thank you very much. So, Professor, we can continue and the same way, maybe. So, Professor talked about a critical period hypothesis and, of course, other aspects. So, I think also, Professor Chomsky Krashen, you summarized the results of, let's say, the research you have done over the 50 years. Mm-hmm. In few sentences. So please, Professor also talked about the importance of reading. Do you think, Professor, that I think in one of your books, you talk about free voluntary reading of, I think, fiction and how important it is. So practically speaking, do you have an idea about how much time teachers should devote to self-selected reading in their classroom? And should they set aside classroom, let's say, time?
The important word is self-selected. Let's stay with that for a while. You've got to select it yourself. It's the guarantee that it's going to be really compelling, okay? One good evidence of this is something Garrison Keillor said, the humorist. He said, people, when they find out that I was an English literature major, are always giving me classics as presents. And they're on my shelf. And when I walk by them, all these books that I've gotten as gifts, they're looking down, staring at me, making me feel guilty because I haven't read a single one of them. A book given to you as a gift is assigned reading. That person's going to come back and say, how did you like that book I gave you? All right. That is the problem with assigned reading, why it needs to be self-selected, or if it is recommended, someone who really knows you and who really understands who you are. If there's a couple of people in my life, I will read a book if they say so. One of them is my son. We did a whole thing with Robert Heinlein several years ago in science fiction. When Danny says, try this, Dad, he's always right. One of my favorite genres is science fiction. My cousin, Keith Fahrenheit, brought me a book last time he came up. Of course, I'm going to read it because he knows me. He knows what I like. But in even nonfiction is hard. Nushan Ashtari gave me a book, loaned me a book, recommended it, a nonfiction book, which was very good. But this is rare cases. In general, I don't read. I don't like recommendations. When I was in high school, and I'm telling you this because this happened to everyone listening, I took literature classes, in my case, English literature, British literature, and we were assigned books. I read the books. I took tests on them. I don't remember a single book that I took a test on, even though I passed. Not a single title. The books I read at home, largely baseball stories and science fiction, I remember all of them, and many of them changed my life. They had a profound influence on me. So I would devote no time to assigned reading. It would all be self-selected with plenty of time talking to teachers, helping you select the books, as Professor Mason does with her students. The amount of time is less important than the ability to read what you want to read. When you do that, you get it all. You get language, you get grammar, and you get what you want to teach in literature, theme, plot, all these things.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor. So I have here another question pertaining to translation and language learning. Does translation hinder second language learning? So if yes, how can we teach second language to beginners without the interference of first language?
Make it comprehensible the way Benico Mason does. Draw a picture, use context. A little bit of information in the first language might help occasionally. I'm very hesitant to say this because we don't have lots of research on it. But if students get an idea of what the story's about, and actually bilingual education takes advantage of this, it's going to be a lot more comprehensible. So compelling books with pictures, occasional little bit of background knowledge, use of context. Context is the best teacher. We're kind of suspicious of using context because we're afraid people will make the wrong guess. The famous example is the word in the text is point, and there's a picture of a man pointing. And the critics say, well, you don't know if it's point, finger, or hand, or what. They may come to the wrong conclusion. The studies that have been done shows that most context is not misleading. Most context is pretty much directive, pretty much helps you, pushes you in the right direction. And if you read enough, you get it. This is how we did our first language, how we're doing our second language. If this wasn't true, we would never learn to read.
Interesting. Thank you very much. Just to the audience, if you have any questions, please post them directly in the comment section before we leave. Professor Stephen Krashen, I think since we are talking, maybe we are living, let's say, unprecedented phenomenon that is of COVID-19, this crisis. So do you think that coronavirus opens the door to of finding new strategies in, let's say, teaching foreign languages? I mean, in other words, to what extent has technology contributed positively to the learning and teaching of foreign language?
Technology and COVID is a two-edged sword. It has made things much more possible than ever before because we have really taken advantage of Zoom and connecting the way we're doing now. This has been fabulous. We wouldn't have even thought to have a conversation. Oh my gosh, I got to talk to Noam Chomsky. Come on, I got to see Noam Chomsky and talk to the master and get all this wisdom. This is amazing. This is wonderful. I'll be high on this for several weeks or months. This is great. COVID has made it possible in a way. On the other hand, it can be the death of education. It is an invitation not to have large classes without interaction. It is an invitation to eliminate teachers. Every so often, we all get advertisements. I got one last week. Learn the classics from the great masters, the great teachers. Take a course in history of the United States, British philosophy, the law, and here's an expert giving you lectures. You just put in your computer, you can hear the masters. We don't need teachers. We got them already. Add to that standardized tests. You can take the test. Who needs teachers? I'm sorry I mentioned that because that's what some people will start doing now. Okay. So it could be, and okay, with more use of the computers, this also means you can find out about a lot more things than you ever knew. things that aren't taught in the curriculum because only a few people are interested. Jeff McQuill and I were talking about this. He called this the tail of the curve. You can get things that are, in the 1% of the normal curve that we don't normally get. So this is a virtue. This is wonderful. On the other hand, it could be the death of education.
Interesting. Thank you very much. So, Professor, here's another question from...
Can't hear you. I can't hear you. I'll just sit here, behave myself.
Sorry, maybe
Okay.
Yeah. Another question. So, I think it's about translation, something like that. Can we teach? I think, of course, there are many questions. We're receiving hundreds of questions. So maybe I missed the question. Anyway, it's maybe about can we teach? I think it's about. I'm trying to find out. Please be patient with me.
Sure.
I think I missed the question, I think. Anyway, there are other questions. Yes, here's another question, Professor. What can we, second language learn from heritage language phenomena?
Well, what heritage language has learned from what we know about language acquisition, it's been the other way around. We have learned that traditional methods, as used in beginning heritage language classes, are not very helpful. Grammar practice, correction, forcing kids to talk right away. And we have learned the connection between language and social groups, club memberships. The unfortunate case histories I have read, I've mentioned to you, where kids have, one from Nishana Ashtari, she talks about a situation where one heritage language speaker said, sometimes when I'm at a party, I'm forced to use, my parents get angry at me because I don't use the heritage language, I don't speak Farsi. Or they're criticizing me because I make mistakes, which are natural, of course, and especially if you haven't done a lot of reading. This distances you from your own group. I got a quote in one of my articles. Someone said to a child, the way you speak Spanish, no one would know that you were the daughter of an Argentine. Humiliating and horrible. This is what happens with traditional methodology, and I'd say, unfortunately, ignorance of the normal course of language acquisition. That it's not the child's fault in this case. They needed more input, more time.
Thank you.
Great.
Here's another question, I think. Yes. Can children pick up more than one language at once?
I hope so. Yes. In my life, as I said, one of my ways of doing research is to constantly be involved in languages all the time, which has been the last 50, 60 years. And some I'm good at, some I'm not so good at, some I'm, in the middle. And it's all been amazing. It's been a wonderful tutorial on putting myself in the place of kids who are in language classes. And I can't pick my language. I can't say, now I'm going to do Spanish. Well, I do Spanish, I'm at home and all that, but I read every day as long as I can find books in French. I read in a lot of stuff in German. I've been reading a little bit in Mandarin. I've been reading books in the Roman script, okay, which is mostly where I know my Mandarin. And I found it's been quite helpful. I can have a basic conversation, etc. So I'm experimenting on myself, but doing all the languages at once. I think the brain can handle that pretty well from my own experiences. And kids who grow up bilingual, trilingual, etc., will say the same thing. So I don't think there's a problem there. Once again, I rely on people in the audience who are, I'm sure, an amazing multilingual group to report what has happened to them. Has it been a problem, etc.? It's rare to get mixed up, except if you're a beginner in two languages, you might get mixed up a little. But after a while, it gets firm, and you can do it. They stop interfering with each other, even languages that are close. And I do not confuse German and Yiddish, which are nearly the same language. Okay. Great question. Are you still there? Oh. The communicative approach. Is the communicative approach based on the theory language grows in the mind rather than learned? Is it what makes it effective? The communicative approach, I don't think we should use that term anymore because nobody knows what it means. For some people, communicative means make people talk right away, and even correct their mistakes and teach them grammar. That's communicative. For other people in the domain of comprehensible input, it means what Chomsky would call, and I will call from now on, language development through input. So it's a dangerous term. It can be used as old-fashioned grammar teaching, or it can be used, force people to talk before they're ready, or it could be used in comprehensible input methodology.
Interesting. Thank you very much. I'm sorry for this problem. Maybe it's because it's say that your device is hot.
Let me interrupt you and say the same thing about immersion. Immersion, yes. I think a term we shouldn't use anymore because we don't know what it means. It could mean going to a country and just being there. I've spent maybe 2 months in my life in Taipei in Taiwan. I came out with zero Mandarin. The Mandarin I got later, okay? None of it was comprehensible. The only word I acquired in Mandarin was bingxiling, which means ice cream. Good thing to know, but not quite enough to get around. On the other hand, when I did German, I was a music student in Austria, and it was amazing. It was comprehensible input everywhere. I had a wonderful peer group of native speakers, non-native speakers. English was not the lingua franca in those days, 1962. We recommended books to each other. It was wonderful. Try this, it's good, you'll like it, and you can understand it. So it really did work. One case it worked because it was loaded with comprehensible input. In another case, it hasn't worked. Benico Mason has cases which she compares students in her school who have gone off, say, doing English, who've gone off to an English-speaking country, one case in Canada, person had a job, took class, lived with the family, made very little progress in English. She came back, started doing more reading, made much more progress. It depends on if you're getting the right comprehensible input. People ask me, is music good for you? Well, you're not getting a lot of language this way. It's nothing wrong with it, but usually the same stuff again and again.
Yes, Professor, here's another question. What makes some languages difficult to be learned than others?
Number one, whether they're comprehensible, which is why cognate languages go a lot faster. They're more comprehensible, and that's it. And it's whether you've made friends more than anything else, and whether you find good things to read. I'm making good progress in non-cognate languages. My mini triumph is in Mandarin, because I found some good things to read. Of course, a cognate language goes a lot faster. It's not just the grammar, it's the vocabulary with comprehensibility.
Yes. Thank you very much. So here's another question. How can we translate a stream of consciousness?
I have no idea. I don't know. My answer. Based on my expertise in years of scholarship, I have no idea. Great question.
Okay. Yeah. So actually, I'm receiving hundreds of questions. I can't even. Wow. Please hold on. There are many questions.
Okay, I'm charging you
So,
for
yeah,
overtime. I'm charging you for
you don't,
overtime. I'm getting paid more for this. Don't worry.
you don't, they don't give me even time to pick up one.
Yeah.
Wow. Wow. Yes, I will pick up this one. How can performance-based assessments manifest in EFL classroom or classrooms? Yes.
What you want in an assessment, you want the person preparing to be assessed to get more comprehensible input. That's the idea of assessment. We want, number one, the minimum assessment, and we don't want to test speaking. We don't want to test writing, because students will want to do more speaking and more writing. Teachers want to do more, and that does not cause language acquisition. Writing helps in other ways. It helps thinking, etc., but it doesn't help language acquisition. So whatever we call it, performance-based, etc., I would not base it on conversation and speaking. The only tests I would use are listening comprehension and reading comprehension. They correlate with all the others. That will save us billions of dollars and billions of hours of suffering, I think.
Yes, I think no. Oh, I missed it again. So maybe not this question. Maybe another question about vocabulary, something like that. Actually, there are many questions I'm receiving. Wow. Yes, this one. What's the best way of teaching abstract concepts?
I have no special wisdom on this. Relate the known, the unknown to the known, use diagrams, use figures, context, etc. But I don't have any special thing. What I have discovered, I'll give you a hypothesis. If you get lots of comprehensible input, if you read lots of novels, you will acquire abstract concepts like you never knew, okay? This is the way to get expertise in new areas. As Dr. Chomsky has said, we will find that novels is a better way of learning about people, concepts, etc., than psychology. Let me tell you one success story. I've been waiting for an excuse to talk about my cousin. Here we go, okay? Let me tell you about my cousin Evelyn, who is now 93, I think, and I talked to her a lot. We were very close all through our lives. And she told me once, wondering what to do with herself now, she said her late husband, Marty, who is wonderful, was a lawyer. He'd gone to law school. He had not gone to law school, but he had a law degree, and he knew a lot about law, and that helped him a lot. She said, Stephen, I want to know more about law. I'll take a class in legal terminology. I said, don't do that, Evelyn. I have a suggestion. Read novels by John Grisham. They're all legal novels. She tried it. She agreed that reading John Grisham novels, you read 10 of them, it's like a year of law school. You know concepts, abstract concepts, subtleties about the law you had no idea, and it's very, very pleasant. So that's a good lesson. You want to know about things you don't know? Do novels, read more.
Yes,
Yeah,
Professor.
yeah.
Yes. Here is another question. As far as I understood, you've mentioned that phonetic is acquired through reading. What do you think about those experiencing dyslexia?
Okay, there have been several schools of thought about dyslexia, and there's probably evidence supporting all of them. One I found solves a lot of problems, probably not all, is that dyslexia is simply slow development. Give it time, give it the rich optimal input, and it'll be fine. Gosh, I'm sorry for forgetting her name, a New York professor. She will write me and scold me, and I deserve it. She found some cases of people who were considered dyslexic when they were young, but now as adults, they were quite literate. One had won a Nobel Prize. Many were published authors. She found what happened. They were considered classified as dyslexic when they were like 11 or 12. They found an area that they were very interested in, and started reading narrowly in that area, their dyslexia vanished. So in at least some cases, dyslexia is simply slow development. And many people have commented on this. We decide that these syllabi that we're following are kind of, the word of God, and they have to be in this order. No, they are arbitrary, made up by people, sometimes on very little evidence. Let people move at their own speed, find out what their interests are. And Professor Chomsky has talked about this as well, and everything will happen. Let them read narrowly in their area, start with comic books, and they will be fine. The other cases where there's some real mechanical problem, I really don't know. I think this variable has to be separated in the professional literature. Is phonics the answer? I kind of doubt it, because phonics doesn't work that well with children without dyslexia. So what I would do is try to use what works in general, and that is lots of interesting reading, take our time, let them develop.
Thank you very much. Professor, here is another question. Does all language, let's say, acquisition take place in the mind? Isn't there a place or a role for emotion in the process?
Oh, of course, yes. I talked about this a little bit. If you're upset, if you're nervous, you're not going to do well. If you're excited, you're going to do a lot better. If there's someone you really like, you identify, you start speaking the way they do. Absolutely. Our lives are just drenched with emotion. It affects absolutely everything we do. I don't have an expertise on it. I just recognize its importance. We had this concept of the affective filter years ago, which I still think there's a lot of merit to it. If you're upset, nervous, etc., you may understand the input, but it won't penetrate. It won't penetrate those parts of the brain that do language acquisition, etc. If you don't feel like you're one with the group, the output filter will come into play. This is a wonderful area for research, totally important, of course.
Thank you very much. Here is another question, maybe the one I missed. How can translation contribute to improve language?
Okay, we're using it a little bit. We're not doing concrete translation. Say it in one language, say it in the other. That's a guarantee of failure, because you won't be paying attention, you'll be translating. And what I find annoying is that these bilingual books are very successful, where there's a story in French and then the same story in English, and people like them. Language lovers like them. People like us who are fascinated and like making comparisons, okay? I don't think they help much. What you want is a really good story. But the way Benico Mason uses it, I think, is great value. And the way it's used in bilingual education, I think, has value. An occasional brief translation, sure. Probably no harm, probably can open things up. We have been debating how much of it is important and necessary. Bilingual education really understands it. What they say is, a child comes to the country, let's say is 8 years old, comes from the United States, from Mexico. He gets a good education, he's had some education in Spanish. You continue that in Spanish. You continue building up his content in Spanish. That means he understands more of the world. When he gets the subjects in English, he'll understand them more. And he may get interested in certain authors in Spanish and want to read other authors in the same topic. So I think translation can help as long as it's in the service of making input comprehensible. Technology, yes. Oh, I can do this. Does technology turn learning into acquisition? Does it help? Well, I don't think anything will turn learning into acquisition. The traditional methods are based on the hypothesis that first you learn it, you practice it over and over again, and gradually the brain treats it as acquired. I think there is overwhelming evidence that this does not happen. This is a totally different process. So technology, you can do a wrong thing better, more efficiently with technology, but it won't make it better, in my opinion. So there are other good uses of technology. Let's do those.
Yes, I think there are hundreds of questions. I cannot even stop them. So anyway, yes. Here is another question from a semiotician. He's interested in meaning and creating meaning. And he said, please ask Professor why he appears, let's say, with the empty library background. Does it have a meaning?
Does what have a meaning?
Yes, that you appear now live with the library empty, the background, your background. Yes,
Here's
empty library.
Here's the reason why. Here, I'll tell you the
Does this
reason.
have a meaning? Yeah.
Yes, it does. You can ask that question.
Interesting.
Yeah, I just had my 80th birthday. Okay, feeling pretty good. Which means I'm getting older. My wife is getting older. We don't need this house. Okay, it's time to start thinking about getting something cheaper. Our fantasy is that the children will all move in with us, which would be wonderful. Okay, but if that doesn't happen, we've got to start giving things away. And I'm doing what Professor Chomsky talked about, of giving books away where I can. So that's why you see the empty shelves. I've probably given away. Well, Thomas Jefferson gave 6,000 books away to help start the Library of Congress. I think I've given 6,000 away too. We all are doing this, people my age. That's why they're empty.
Thank you very
how
much.
can we motivate students to learn English? Okay, Veronica, if I may call you by your first name, this is the answer. You can't. You can't say you should learn English because it's good for you. But what you can do is get them excited about reading something, is have interesting discussion. It's the topic that we're interested in. Not getting them interested in English, but getting them interested in reading more about various things. Get them interested in reading Noam Chomsky. His books are available in English. You'll probably find it easier to find in English. Your students will. Their English will improve. In fact, everything about them will improve. No question. So that's the secret. Okay, the internet and getting away from books. They may have good performance, but not knowledge. I will give you my expert opinion. I don't know. We don't have the research yet. It's a very fair question. From the research up till 2010, as I mentioned, there was no decline in reading, although people love to pretend there is. They love to talk about it when the data simply didn't show it at all. Over 40 years, there's no decline. They read different things. There's more reading off screens, okay? They're reading different things, but they're still reading a lot. So I'm not too worried about this. And if the next question, which is part of your question, which is very good, is this affecting their knowledge of the world, their subject matter knowledge? Are people still learning things from reading the way they used to? I don't know. I depend on you to do the research. I will read it and report on it.
Yes, here is another question about fossilization. Yes.
Well, before saying when does the second language fossilize, I will ask, does it fossilize? Is it only the output filter? Is it only because we don't consider ourselves to be members of a group, or because we don't get enough input? The things that fossilize, persistent errors, are generally late acquired. Let me give you some personal data on this. Case of possible fossilization. One of my friends at the University of Southern California, when I was in the linguistics department, was my neighbor, Masayoshi Shibatani, who studied with Professor Chomsky and did his dissertation on Japanese syntax. And Dr. Shibatani, really nice guy. He was my expert on English too. He knew more about English than anybody I knew. So I always went to him with questions because he always knew the answers. And we became pretty good friends. In fact, my son ran into his daughter recently after all these years. It was very nice. Now, Dr. Shibatani, when he wrote in English, it was perfect. In speaking, I noticed he occasionally dropped the third person singular. He has known that rule since he was 9 years old, okay? And he knows that rule better than anyone in California, I'm sure. So the answer is not learning the rule. The answer is going to be with continuing to get input, but considering yourself a member of the group that uses that item. That is going to be, it's a wide open area for research. I don't think fossilization, I suspect that fossilization doesn't really happen. Also, in looking at Merrill Swain's research, I have found glimpses of evidence that show that kids fossilize, they eventually get it, it just takes longer. So what's the problem? If it's a rule like the third person singular, that doesn't matter that much for communication, and it's generally stuff like that. So I would say, don't worry about it.
Thank you very much. Here's another question, Professor. Do you think materials such as textbooks and technology are necessary to teach foreign languages in the classroom?
Textbooks, perfect textbook. I would have in a classroom a dictionary and a grammar because people get curious. They want to know about linguistics, and I would satisfy that curiosity. Wonderful story told to me by a teacher working in natural approach under the supervision of Tracy Terrell. She used natural approach in her classes. And following Dr. Terrell's advice, she allowed a certain amount of time, 10 minutes, for questions on grammar. I asked her, how many questions did you get? Oh, maybe 2 or 3. Does that mean 2 or 3 a week? No, 2 or 3 a semester. People really don't care as much as we think they do. But I would have a grammar book in the back just in case people get curious, learn a little bit about language, nothing wrong with it. And also dictionaries, just in case you're curious. But they're certainly not necessary. Technology necessary? No. Helpful? Yes. Look what we're doing now. The potential for stories on the computer is fabulous. And PDF books. My books, by the way, now, the ones I've been able to dig up, I have put in PDF form. My articles are all in PDF form, and they are available free download. This is what we need to do these days. This is helping everyone. And stories. People are putting good stories now. Story listening group, Dr. Mason's group, has been putting stories now made available. This will increase, which is very, very good. So technology can certainly help.
Okay, thank you very much. I think, Professor, maybe this will be the last question, right? Or you have time to receive other questions?
Let me make a confession. This is the best part. This is where I know what I need to go after, what the issues are. And there are people asking questions who are have expertise I will never have. There are people who have taught for years. I could follow one of the people around. Let's say you teach 3rd grade. I could come to their class for 2 years, teach for 2 years. I wouldn't have a fraction of the knowledge that you do. So this is how I can begin to tap into the incredible knowledge that teachers have. So I am gaining from this. Let's have some more questions.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes. Yes, maybe here, how is it possible to make second language learning natural in a non-English speaking environment?
Several ways. Number 1, books, of course. A lot of people speak English very well who've never lived in an English-speaking country, okay? Like Grace Cho's Korean-speaking subjects who got it all through reading, built up their heritage language, through media, etc. What counts is comprehensible input, not immersion. Immersion works if it's comprehensible input, but what counts is comprehensible, highly interesting input presented in abundance. And you don't need to be in the country. I've made progress in most of my languages, and very little of it has been in the country. Like Spanish, I've had maybe 2 weeks in Mexico, that's all. I'm doing okay. So yes, we can do it. Yes.
Yes, maybe this question. No, not this one. I want to.
No, not this one. I have the slightest idea. I can't answer it.
Yeah.
But Gabsia Mohammed will find an answer someday and tell us all about it, I hope.
Yes. So actually, I'm receiving hundreds of questions. You don't give me even time to choose anyone. Are you bored? Oh, so missed it again. So I will just recap. So do you think that we can apply the same stages children acquire language through, to teach language for adults the same way?
Yes, and this is basically our claim, that the language acquisition device is still there, and adults have access to it. The language universals that Professor Chomsky and colleagues have posited are available to everybody. They don't fade away. If it was not possible, if the language acquisition device faded away, we didn't have access to universal grammar, adults would do no better with artificial languages than real languages. They could learn languages that disobey the universal principles, the ones that obey, with the same thing. That's not the case. The studies done now, Bonnie Schwartz's study, other colleagues, are investigating whether these universals are available to adults. Very encouraging. Can online teaching be as powerful as face-to-face? I don't know. I hope so. I suspect so. We need to keep doing it. It can be very powerful, that's for sure. So why not keep doing it?
Yes, here's another question. Yes.
Al-Hadim, I love this question. What's the best way to teach writing to ESL students? My goodness. Let me talk about writing. More writing will not make you a better writer. It's output. But writing, here we change the topic. The topic is how we use writing to help thinking. Writing can make you smarter. Writing can help you solve problems. And the way it works is this. You write something down, you realize it isn't quite right, you go back and revise, and it comes better and better and better. The secret in writing is revision. Having read all the research on revision, I am so happy when I have to revise because I'm learning something new. I'll tell you a story. This was told to me by my son and my daughter-in-law who went to school at the University of Texas where they met. And one of their professors was John Tate, who passed away recently, and he was one of the great living mathematicians. And someone once asked him, "What is your work day like?" And he said, "Well, about 20% of the time I'm doing good work. About 30% I'm making mistakes. And the rest of the time I'm sitting around wondering how I could be so stupid, how I can make so many." This is John Tate, one of the great masters. Revision. We're making mistakes all day long. There's nothing wrong with being wrong. In fact, being wrong is part of the process. You go back and revise, go back and revise, go back and revise. Ernest Hemingway made one of the most useful comments ever about writing. And this is Hemingway's language, not mine. The first draft of anything is shit. Once you get that, you've broken through. Write the first draft. You're going to see there are problems. You revise. Write another draft, revise. And eventually, you'll come out with something good. So the best way to teach writing is to tell people, just start writing what's on your mind and be prepared to revise. What I've learned about revision too, many people have said this. They've said when you want to revise, take a break. When you have a problem in writing, get up from your desk, do something mindless. Come back in just a couple of minutes, you will find that the problem is starting to be resolved. So the best way to do writing, write a lot, write all the time, write regularly, write to solve problems that are of interest to you. Be prepared to take breaks all day long. What I do during breaks is I do dishes or clean up my office, just put away a couple of things, then go back. That's how we can deal with the inauthentic labor of life. So that's wisdom on writing. If a child was born in a bilingual, multilingual, would he be able to acquire the whole languages simultaneously? Maybe. Can you acquire all the languages around you simultaneously? If you get comprehensible input from people you connect with, yes. It will take a little longer. What we've seen in the research on bilingual children who grow up in a rich bilingual environment, they do grow up to be bilingual. If parents keep it up, there is a small period of several months where they mix the language. Then it goes away. Not to worry. It's going to be fine.
Maybe. Okay. No, yeah.
Are we born ready to learn language? Yes, I think Professor Chomsky is absolutely correct. And I feel that he's more correct all the time. It is innate. The universal principles are there. When you provide the right kind of input, meaningful input, interesting messages that are comprehensible, the language acquisition device goes into action, and it goes into action without our consciously trying to do it. We're born ready to learn language.
Okay. So I have other questions here. Okay. Maybe this. No, not this one. I missed the question. Maybe this one. Not.
It's about Bloom's taxonomy.
Not this one. Yeah.
Okay, another one.
I have. Yeah. Yes.
Do languages keep your brain young? Probably, yes. It certainly is good for the brain. It's not bad. We know bilingualism is good for the brain. Okay, no
Yeah.
question. People who are bilingual, well, they have job opportunities in some cases.
Maybe the same thing with polyglots.
Yeah, exactly. They are more flexible in thinking, switching from one thing to the other. So there are all kinds of things. They do slightly better in school. Maybe they're smarter. Studies have been done. Someone in the exact same comparing people in the same situation, one has kept the home language, one hasn't. The one who's kept the home language does a little better in school. So we know bilingualism is not bad for you, and it's probably good. That's what Jim Cummins concludes. I think that's a very good conclusion. The best way to keep your brain young, of course, is to drink coffee, but that's another. That's my personal view.
Thank you very much. I'm trying to choose some questions because I think more than 6,000 people are following us, joining us live now.
Great.
That's why I'm receiving hundreds of questions at
Hey,
once.
6,000 people, all you guys out there, all you wonderful people out there, please follow me on Twitter. I want to build up my followers. I want to catch up to Justin Bieber. Help me out.
Of course, I think you have a YouTube channel, right? Krashen, Stephen Krashen.
I haven't paid any attention to it. I should. It's too much work. I know it's there, and it has an earlier conversation with Professor Chomsky.
Yes.
Which you know all about.
Yeah, of course.
You know it happened.
What are the best solutions for reading comprehension difficulties?
Okay, lots and lots of very easy reading and lots of knowledge, which you get from reading. And in easy reading, ladies and gentlemen, 2 words, comic books. Let me repeat, the research on comic books is outstanding. Children who read comics read more. Children with lower socioeconomic status who read lots of comics read better than children of higher status, who don't read comics. I have found comics to be an amazing thing in my life. When I was in, I think the 2nd grade, I was in the low reading group. My father brought home comics. Within a couple of months, I was in the regular reading group, and the rest is history. I must throw out a thank you to my sister. When I was 9 years old, she got me a library card and helped me select books, and it all happened. Self-select books and lots of comics and stories, and it will get better.
Here's another question. Learning another language is often done by thinking in the mother tongue. Is this a problem, or how can be avoided?
I can give you a suspicion. Thinking in the mother tongue, my suspicion is that it naturally goes away as your competence in the language grows, and may depend on the topic. I don't know. It'd be pretty hard to do research on it, but I'd love to see the results. When I hear a story in another language and it's interesting, or read a good book, the first language is nowhere around. And I'm sure that's true with you too.
Yeah. Yes. How precisely could we make the content is comprehensible without using grammar translation?
We can
So I
make
think
it
you already
precise, we can make it precise enough where it makes sense. And that opens the door to acquisition. If you rely on grammar translation and translation all the way through, people will never read. And there will be very little acquisition. So a little bit of background knowledge, as I've talked about, yeah, that could be helpful. But for the most part, don't worry about it. It'll go away. Code switching. The next question. Is code switching effective to develop linguistic competence? Maybe. It's pretty hard to stop. I've done it a lot. And it helps move the conversation along sometimes and makes it more fluent and more fun sometimes. I don't think it's harmful at all. Might be helpful, but there's no research I know of. There is research in bilingual education that says that use of the first language helps, that concurrent translation, translating every sentence as you go, is not helpful. So we can learn things from that. Occasional help, yes. Constant translation, no.
Yes, maybe to what extent the age or affects for language acquisition, particularly the old age learners. Yes.
Let me talk about my therapist. My language therapist is a guy named Steve Kaufman. I get great advice from him. He's a famous polyglot, and he also always says, he always says these wise things. So I pay very close attention to him. Steve Kaufman knows about 20 languages, and he's really good. I have been with him, seeing him speak these languages. I've been with him when he spoke in Chinese. He's been amazing. I have been with him. I'm moving over because I'm running out of battery where I can plug in. I have been with him when he's listened to a lecture in French and he's asked questions. We've had dinner together at restaurants where the language is Spanish. He's done very well. He's really good. Here's what he says. 20 languages. He's done 6 of them since age 62. Wow. I met Lom Kato, famous polyglot from Hungary, who was doing language acquisition well into her 70s and 80s. I don't think there's a limit. I think we can do it at any age. Testable hypothesis, and I'm testing it right now because I'm still very active with languages right now. And I'd like to hear, be fun if people would share their experiences, older people. Looking for the plug. High tech.
Yes.
Okay. Do I think men and women acquire a language differently?
Yes.
In profoundly, no. I think it's fundamentally the same process. Okay. So we're still comprehensible input, etc.
Maybe.
We did this one already.
Yeah. Yeah. How can we rely on the effective filter hypothesis 100% to improve the language?
Yeah, this is a fundamental question, of course, a good one. Don't correct errors. Don't force students to talk before they're ready. Try to be comprehensible. Get them into interesting books. Say things that are interesting. That's the big thing. Make sure the input is interesting, and people differ on what's interesting to one person is not to the other, and that makes it tough to do sometimes. Can we use the mother tongue to explain difficult grammatical rules? Yes, we can. I don't think we should bother unless you're a linguist. I mean, if someone explains to me a difficult rule in another language, I listen because I'm a member of a lunatic fringe group, like many of us are. I think grammar is inherently interesting. This is very strange, okay? We are 5% of the population, all right? Most people don't care. If you have to use the first language to explain it, probably people won't care. That's why it's probably not a good idea. Are we supposed to bring text? Oh gosh, can we choose any text related to the theme of the unit? Thank you, Basma. It's a very good question. To me, it's a clear answer. It has to be interesting to each person. It has to be self-selected. Sometimes, as Professor Chomsky has pointed out, the teacher can be so good, they can get people interested in things they didn't know about. Fine. That is the ultimate in literature and reading teaching. Yes, you can do that. You have absolutely succeeded. But most of the time is stuff you think is interesting. Okay. Mr. Hamzi asked a very good question. Can we acquire a language just by reading and neglecting listening? No. But you can do it with a lot of reading and some listening. And again, I invite you to research this because there is no research on this. What has happened to me is most of what I get in input is reading because that's what I have available. I live in California. I can't walk down the street and interrupt people and find out what language they speak, etc. I don't run into people who speak other languages. So I read a lot, let's say in Spanish. I read a lot in French, occasionally in German. Occasionally I'll find someone who knows that language. And it might be, I had a conversation in German a few months ago. I hadn't spoken German in 5 years. It didn't matter because I'd been reading in German and I had the background. So reading is still, for many of us, the core. If you could get stories to listen to and broadcast, fine. I haven't found much like that for myself that's of interest to me. Okay, next question.
Yeah, I missed it. So he want to teach his maybe kids two languages at the same time.
Okay.
How can he encourage them? Yes.
Here are the rules. Speak the language in the language you want to. Some people say one language, one child. I don't know, maybe that works. I know it's done a lot and it does work. Don't worry about what they say. Don't worry if they don't answer you in that language. If the language is, let's say you're in Morocco and you're trying to do English and you speak Arabic and English at home, don't worry if they don't answer you in English. They're not going to. When they go to school, they're going to use the language of school. They're going to use the language of their French. But it's going to be there. I had, again, personal anecdote, very good friends where the father was from Kerala, from India, and his language was Malayalam. Mother was from New Jersey, native language English. Dad always spoke Malayalam to the children, okay? They always answered in English. Mom always spoke English. Then they moved to Kerala. Within a short time, a few weeks, they started speaking Malayalam. It was all there, folks. Don't worry. The comprehension is the core of the language. When the time comes, they will do just fine. Another story, which I think one of the experts on bilingualism, Werner Leopold, talked about. I've heard about it. I haven't found it in any of his books. He lived in Southern California, Santa Monica, close to where I live. And he spoke German to his older daughter, and she always answered him in English. I'm sorry, younger daughter. She always answered him in English. And it went on for years and years. He never heard her speak German. And they had a wonderful father-daughter relationship. They talked, they spoke, great relationship. He spoke German, she spoke English. Then they went to Germany. She was a teenager, 17 years old. He had never heard her speak German ever. They went to a party. She met a young man. He was amazed to hear this beautiful German come from her mouth. I don't know if that really happened. People have told me about it. I would love to find out and hear similar stories.
Yeah, maybe here we can talk about the importance of the silence period.
Yeah, that's what it had. She had 17 years silent period. Exactly. Okay.
Yeah.
Is it forbidden for anyone to use the first language in an EFL class? No, I would not forbid it. If there's a problem, I would settle it. If it's an occasional word that helps in making things comprehensible, fine. This story is about two puppies who went to Mars in a spaceship. Then it gives you some idea of what's going on, but you can't let it dominate the class. Your goal is to give comprehensible input in the second language.
Interesting. So they can use the first language in class.
A little bit, yeah, not a lot.
Interesting. Okay. There.
Is learning grammar useful in learning a language? Not a lot. Not, well, again, conscious knowledge of grammar has only one function for us, and that's so we can correct ourselves while we're talking. We can correct ourselves when we write. If you try to use this in conversation, it's going to make it very hard to say things. It's going to get in the way. And you don't need to know the rule in order to acquire it. There's not a link between knowing grammar and language acquisition. Language acquisition comes without the necessity of knowing the grammatical rule. The best way to acquire vocabulary, but once you get beyond basic conversation, the best way, of course, is reading, that you select, that you think is interesting. And it doesn't seem to matter what the topic is. You'll get all the vocabulary eventually. Next.
Okay. Yes. Maybe so the same questions, but I'll try to find new one. Yes, maybe this one.
Which is better, deductive or inductive? Should you be told the rule or should you figure it out? I was very interested in all this in the old days when I thought grammar is the way you learn languages. Now I think it doesn't much matter because grammar is so peripheral. It's not the main thing in language teaching. It is very peripheral, very much to this outside. I would let kids want to look up rules and do it deductively, fine. Inductive means you have to set it up so they can pretty much guess the rule and get it right. This is pretty time consuming. So practically speaking, I wouldn't do very much of it and I would just state the rule.
Okay. Yes, this is another question.
Okay, are there basics we should teach before we expose them to reading? The prerequisite is you want reading passages that they have a chance to understand. That's it. That, in fact, that could be done from the beginning, okay? Some of you know a wonderful book called No David. The whole text is No David, okay? It's about a little boy misbehaving and the mother shouting out, no David, no David. And the last line, of course, is, I love you, David. And the mom hugs the child. You can understand a lot of that without knowing much of the language. We want easy books, as easy as possible. If they're comprehensible, that's okay. Comprehensibility is the requirement. At least so they don't have to understand every word, but they understand enough so they can kind of acquire a lot from doing it.
Yes, maybe this is a question. Can we think without language? I think maybe he wants to talk about the use of images.
Yeah, I'm sure we can, but I have zero expertise in this area. So,
yeah. Yes. How to teach languages where there aren't any books.
Yeah, or comic books. Comprehensible input through stories. Then what you can do is from the stories you tell in class, create some books in the so-called dialect that you're trying to use. If there's a writing system. If not, use any writing system that works.
Maybe. So, yes, this is another question. Please take my question. Do you think that...
Okay, in the case of natural acquisition, learners are subconscious, as in first language, or in the case of naturalistic second language, people are conscious to at least a certain extent. The real question here is, does natural second language acquisition require consciousness, or does consciousness arrive? It said, I am sure that you don't need consciousness to acquire language. That's, I think, pretty well established. But for people like us, who are in love with the study of language, who find it pleasing and interesting to learn about grammar, and again, we are the minority, all right? We sometimes can't help but think about rules. Please don't feel guilty. It's not necessary, but if you do it, enjoy yourself. I do it. I can't help it. Most of the time I don't. The more interesting the input is, the less I do it. In fact, I've had this experience. Reading in Spanish has been so much fun. At the same time, I was reading two books. One was a book by Isabella Allende in real Spanish for native speakers by native speakers. It's the story of Zorro, which I found just fascinating. Isabella Allende is a wonderful author. At the same time, I found myself reading a graded reader, which was much easier, and it had a dictionary in the back. I was tempted to look up every word in the dictionary just to make sure I got it right, occasionally look up a grammar rule. This is the undertow. This is my background as a conscious language learner. I soon realized what I was doing, okay? And I'm better off with a book without a dictionary. I got much more vocabulary from Zorro. The dictionary actually got in the way. We do it. I don't think it helps us very much to consciously think about it. And the way to get around it is have something interesting. I wasn't even tempted to look up words when I was reading Zorro because the story was so interesting, I forgot that it was in another language. So have these experiences through cartoons or what is the word?
Games.
Okay, games. Yes, it is possible to make progress in language through games. I am an admirer of many of the games. I think many of the games are absolute genius. When my son was into gaming, he said a lot of them are much harder than anything we do in school. Okay. Yeah. How much language do you get? There is some, yeah, but some games are more verbal than others. But I don't think you'll do as well as you do in reading. Again, I might be wrong. There might be these complicated, wonderful games that involve a lot of language and comprehensible input. And if they develop those and they come around, that's wonderful. Go do it.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor. I think we are running more than 2 hours.
Yep.
I'm still receiving questions, I think. So, yes.
Teacher, would you please recommend unique, effective methods? I would use Benico Mason's methods. I would go to benicomason.net and do story listening in the beginning and look up story listening. Benico Mason, just Google her, you'll find it. And we've co-authored things. You find it in my website, sdkrashen.com. And the intermediate method, which is gradual, graded, self-selected reading, gradually moving into reading material, starting with easy. When you've reached the stage that students can read so-called authentic books written by native speakers for native speakers, you're done. You've done it. That's the goal. They won't need you anymore. My Spanish is not perfect. It would not help me to take a Spanish class because I can already read authentic Spanish. I can already have conversations with mildly cooperative native speakers, okay? So I don't need the class. I can get the comprehensible input elsewhere. The class is designed to bring you to the point where you can use the real world, and that is the point of all education. The point of education is not to make you a master. The point of education is to make you a participant, and then it happens on your own when you're in the outside world, to make the real world comprehensible. So that's what we want to do with beginners.
Yes, I think we cannot take all questions because I'm still receiving hundreds of questions. Wow. Maybe, yes.
Okay, is there a possibility to have a context for teaching English as a lingua franca? English is the universal lingua franca. In the 40 years or 50 years or so I've been traveling, I have seen the change. In the old days, yeah, you could go speak other languages. Now it's English everywhere you go in large cities, hotels, restaurants, etc. When you speak the other language, they answer you in English no matter where you go. I have family in Israel. Very fond of. We get along very, very well. The kids my age, they're now all in their 80s and 70s. They speak English as well as I do, okay? Some of them better. The older folks, I spoke Hebrew and Yiddish, okay? Mostly Yiddish, which I really enjoyed. The younger people, forget it. It's been everywhere. Airlines speak English to each other. When Korea talks to Poland, they speak English. We are speaking, Morocco talks to California. We are speaking English all the time. It has already happened. I wonder about the future of other languages. What's going to happen? Someone coined the phrase killer languages, that Spanish is a killer language of indigenous Indian languages. English is the massive killer language of all. It is, I wonder if it's only a matter of time.
So maybe, Professor, I'm going to take other two questions before we, yeah. So because we are going to dwell in here, and they bombarded you with questions, and I think this will last maybe even for hours, 4 hours, and we will not finish.
Yeah, how can we develop humor competence in them? Well, I have collections of jokes. I use them in my speeches, and I think they're wonderful. One of us should start writing some joke books in basic English, more advanced, more sophisticated, keep it simple. I think people are already doing it with riddles. I think it's a great idea. We can develop humor by telling jokes. A great way to do it. I love the question. Please do it. And I would like other people to do it in the languages I am trying to acquire. Great, great idea. Love the question.
Yeah. Yes. I'm sorry for others because I haven't taken your questions, but lots of questions actually. I'll do maybe.
How do you understand a language when spoken and written, but you cannot speak it? Our comprehension is always going to be ahead of our productions. That could be one reason. Another is you don't feel like a member of the group. You're not comfortable using it. But I would like to interview people who have this problem to see what they say about it. What are their thoughts and feelings? Very good question.
Yes. Does co-teaching have positive effects on learners' writing skills?
It depends on how it's done, co-teaching, with two teachers, etc. I don't know. I would have to see things tried out. In terms of writing, to get the writing code, people have to do a lot of reading, and maybe you can stimulate reading, present people with other options. In terms of writing, the concept is writing makes you smarter, revision is good for you, and people working together can show how that works.
Yes,
is it really following a natural order? Oh, yes, absolutely. This is one of the most stable results we have in the profession, replicated again and again. You can violate it if you do unnatural conscious learning, but that's not real acquisition. It won't take you very far. Great. Let me conclude with this one. How can we design a curriculum? What are the elements of a good syllabus? A good syllabus is going to be comprehensible input. Of course, you knew I was going to say that. If you're worried about covering a grammatical syllabus, relax. If the input is interesting and comprehensible, all the language the students are ready to acquire is there. What we call I+1 is automatically there if the input is interesting and comprehensible and there's enough of it. We don't have to construct a grammatical syllabus. The idea of a grammatical syllabus is now obsolete. It's like trying to decide what food I should eat so I can get the right vitamins with each thing you eat. No, have a balanced diet, lots of good food. The vitamin E will be there, the calcium will be there in just the right amounts. So that's how language works. Our job is not to be grammarians constructing syllabi. Our job is to say things that are interesting and comprehensible, help students find things to read that they really want to read, that are exciting and that are comprehensible. That's language teaching.
So thank you very much, Professor. I think finally we come to the end of this webinar. I really appreciate it. Thank you for answering all the questions. Thank you very much for having taken the time to be here with us for this enlightening webinar, historic webinar with Professor Noam Chomsky. Thank you also to the audience for their active participation. Sorry for those questions. We haven't taken all questions, of course, because I'm receiving not any but thousands of questions. Thank you for your understanding. Yes, any word before?
Thank you for the invitation, for interacting with you, and the opportunity to converse with Noam Chomsky. Oh my goodness. This was absolutely amazing. So thanks for that.
Yeah, our pleasure. Yeah, you are actually heroes of many generations, and we have been looking forward to this historic day. Thank you very much for accepting the invitation. I hope to see you here in Morocco very soon.
You bet. You bet. And I'd like to thank the makers of the coffee that woke me up and got me through this. Okay.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody. See you. Bye.
Bye.
Yes, thank you very much, everybody. So I think this webinar will be translated into Arabic for those who don't speak Arabic. شكرا لكم باللغة العربية. شكرا لكم على حضوركم معنا اليوم. أتمنى أن يكون هذا اللقاء رائع في المستوى المطلوب، وسنحاول أن نترجم هذا اللقاء إلى اللغة العربية لكي تعم الفائدة. أنا برجو نشر هذا اللقاء على نطاق واسع، وشكرا لكم وإلى لقاء آخر. والسلام عليكم.